All right, so we're going to be looking at loops in the next few videos, and a loop is a control structure that provides a way to do iteration in programming. And iteration is a process where you repeat something over and over again until a certain condition is met or until a certain condition is not met. And this can help automate tasks and so on. And there's many different kinds of loops in programming. What we're going to look at right now is one of the more common ones, and this is a for loop. All right, so this is the syntax right here. This is an actual code, but this is how it's formatted, and I'll create a real for loop in a second. But just to show you what goes in here, so we have for, and then we have some parentheses, and three different expressions that are separated by semicolons, which are a little weird. You'll probably mess up and use commas, but it's going to be semicolons here. Now, the initial expression is where we initialize a variable or counter to use within the loop. And then the condition expression is going to be the condition that the loop will continue to run as long as that condition is met. So as long as this is true, it's going to run. Once it's false, then the loop will no longer run. And then we have the increment expression, which is going to be executed after each iteration of the loop. Okay, every time it loops, that's called an iteration. It's going to run after every one of those, and it usually increments the variable, because if you keep your variable or your counter the same, you're going to have an infinite loop. You need to increment that. And then the statement is just going to be your code executed, and you need to use curly braces like you would a function to execute a code block. All right, so let's just comment that out because that will break our script. And then we're going to come down here and let's create a for loop. Okay, so just like a function, parentheses, and curly braces. Then we want our initial expression, which I'm going to say let I. I is very common variable to use in loops. So we'll say set that to 0. Then we want to put our semicolon, because these three expressions are separated with a semicolon. The condition that I want this loop, the code to run as long as this is met, is going to be as long as I is less than or equal to 10. Okay, so as long as that condition is met, this loop will run. And then lastly here, I'm going to put in the increment expression, which will be I++. So we learned about that in the past video. This will just increment by 1. All right, so basically it starts at 0. It's going to go through, then it's going to increment by 1. So I will then be equal to 1. It's going to go through again. It's going to run whatever code we put in here every time up until this is no longer true. So let's just do a console log in here. I'll just put a string, we'll say number, and then I'm just going to concatenate on the I variable. And we'll save that and run it. And you'll see we're going to get number 0 all the way up to number 10. Now it stops here because it no longer meets this condition. It goes through this last time and says, well, now I doesn't match this. It's not less than or equal to 10, so we're not going to run this again. Okay, if I change this to 11 and save, then it's going to go up to 11. If I change this initialization here from 0 to, let's say, 5, and then I save it, then it's going to start at 5. All right. And it's gonna just increment by 1 each time. If I wanted to, I could do something like I equals, let's say, I plus 2. If I save that, then we get 5. It's going to skip 6, 7, skip 8, 9. So it's basically incrementing by 2. But most commonly, you're going to see this. And let's just set that back to 0. And let's set this back to 10. Now, you might be asking why I'm using let, because you know that I use const unless I can't. So in this case, if I were to use const here and save that, I get assignment to constant variable, because remember, we're initializing I here as 0, but it's going to get changed in every iteration. So we can't have this as a constant. We use let. Now, I also showed you in a past video that we have block scope here. Right, so if I come outside of the loop and I console log I'm going to get an error unless I use var. Because remember, var is not block scoped. So if I do that, then I'm going to get 11. But I would highly recommend that you use let when you create for loops. Now you're going to have situations where you check to see if I is equal to something or greater than or less than something, and maybe do something else based on that. So for instance, if I want to say put in an if statement here, and if I say if I is equal to 7, and then let's say I just want to output and say 7 is my lucky number. So I want to output that if it's 7. And then if I didn't want number 7 to show, I just want this 7 is my lucky number, then I could put an else and then move this into here. So now if I save that, it's not going to show number 7, it's just going to show 7 is my lucky number instead. Now there will be times where you will nest loops, so I'm just going to show you that real quick, and it can get a little confusing when you have, multiple levels of loops, but just to give you a simple example, let's do the same thing here where we set I, but let's set it to 1 and say as long as I is less than or equal to 10, and then I plus plus, we want to increment by 1, and we'll do the same kind of console log thing here. But still within this loop, I'm going to open up another for loop. Now when you do this, you want to make sure you don't use I again. You want to use something different, and it's common to use J. So we'll say let J equals 1. I'm going to do the same condition here. I'll say as long as I is less than or equal to 10, and I'm sorry, J. You don't want to do that. You want to do J. Yeah, or else you're going to get an infinite loop. And then let's increment J, and then in here what I want to do is show, I want this to do the console log like we already have here starting at 1, and under each number here I want to show that number times 1, that number times 2, all the way up to 10. That's what this represents right here. So let's console log a string that actually says like 1 times 1 equals 1, 1 times 2 equals 2, etc. So we'll use a template string here, and I'll say I, and then we'll just put a asterisk here times J, and then an equal sign, and then the actual expression to be evaluated is going to be I times J. So if I save that, what we're going to see is well, actually, let me comment this one out. We're going to see number 1, and then under it 1 times all the way up to 10, then 2, and then 2 times all the way up to 10. And that's because of this. If I change this 10 to a 5, then it's going to show 1 times 1 all the way up to 5 for each of these. All right, and we could do as many as we want. If I put this first one to 100, it's going to show me all the way up to 100, and it's very fast. So that's a nested loop. So let me actually should say nested loops. And what I want to show you now is how we can use a for loop to loop through an array. Now I don't do this very much because there's a for each method that we can use. It's a high order array method we're going to get into in a couple videos from now that we can use to loop through arrays and do the same thing, but it is possible to use a for loop as well. So let's say we have names or whatever, anything you want to put into an array. I'm just going to put a bunch of strings here with names, and we'll say John and I don't know, Tim. Okay, so we have some names. Now to loop through this, I'm going to say for, I'm going to initialize my variable, so we'll set let I, set that to 0, and then here for a condition we can say as long as I is less than the length of the array. So we'll say names dot length, and then we need to increment I, so we'll say I plus plus, and then within here we can access each one by its index. I is now going to represent its index, right? Because it starts at 0, so this will be 0, then that'll be 1, 2, 3, and 4. So let's just console log each one. We'll say names, and then we'll put the I as the index in here, and I'll save that, and now you see it's going to loop through and it's going to show each name. Now those of you that are just learning this for the first time, I want you to try a little challenge. So pick a name here, let's say Sarah, and instead of just printing Sarah, have it print Sarah is the best. So if you want to pause the video and try that out, you can do that now. But basically all we have to do, there's a few ways we could do it. If we know the index, which we do, we know Sarah is in the 0 index, so we could just say if I is equal, I'm sorry, the 2 index, if I is equal to 2, then let's do a console log, and we'll just say names I, which is just going to say Sarah, and then we'll concatenate onto that a string and say is the best, else then we just want it to log the name. So we'll put this up here. Oops, and save, and now it says Sarah is the best. So you could do it like that. You could test for the value. So we could say if names and then I, if that is equal to, and then the value, let's say we want to do John is the best, then we can check for John, and now you see it says John is the best. All right, so that's pretty much the basics of for loops. Now, you're probably going to have times where you run into something called an infinite loop. That's a loop that just keeps going and never stops until it crashes your browser, in this case. And that can happen if you mess up the condition, or if you forget to increment. If you want to test it, I wouldn't recommend it, but if you want to test it, you'll just have to most likely force close your browser. But you could put infinity here. So if I did that, obviously I is always going to be less than infinity. That means that this is always going to run, but I'm not going to do that. So you probably will run into infinite loops at some point or another. But in the next video, we're going to talk about the break and continue statements.